There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, wearing the camouflage of a Tuesday night or a shared pizza, and you only recognize their weight in retrospect. They are the pivot points, the hinges on which the door to the rest of your story swings open. For me, that moment wasn't a grand declaration or a bolt of lightning from a clear sky. It was the weight of a human being settling against me on a worn-out couch. It was the quietest of surrenders. And my entire world, a world I had so carefully constructed out of observation and distance, began to irrevocably change. It was the night Julian stopped being the man I secretly loved from afar and started becoming something I didn't have a name for, something terrifying and beautiful that was happening to me and with me. He had been lying on the far end of the sofa, a fortress of pillows between us, a silent treaty I had established weeks ago. The television murmured, casting flickering blue light across the room, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air like tiny, forgotten stars. He was supposed to be watching the movie, a mindless action flick I'd put on specifically to avoid conversation, to fill the space that had grown cavernous between us since Clara left him. But he wasn't watching. I could feel his gaze on the side of my face, a tangible pressure. I was a photographer by trade. I understood the weight of a look, the story it could tell without a single word. His was a story of exhaustion, a deep, soul-level weariness that had hollowed out the light in his eyes. Without a word, he shifted, the old springs of the couch groaning in protest. He dismantled the pillow wall, tossing each one to the floor with a soft thud. And then he moved across the chasm of gray upholstery, an inch at a time, until his shoulder was flush against mine. He sighed, a sound that seemed to carry all the burdens of the last month, and then he let his head fall and rest on my shoulder. It was a simple gesture, one a child might make seeking comfort. But from Julian, it was a cataclysm. My heart, that traitorous organ, began a frantic, panicked rhythm against my ribs, a drumbeat for a war I was certain I was about to lose. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I just sat there, a statue carved from fear and a devastating, hopeless love, feeling the warmth of him seep through my t-shirt, and I wondered if this was the beginning of the end or the end of the beginning. To understand the sheer magnitude of that moment, the seismic shift it represented in the tectonic plates of my carefully guarded emotional world, you have to understand Julian. And you have to understand us. We had met in college, two celestial bodies occupying vastly different orbits that somehow, improbably, found a gravitational pull. I was a quiet art student, more comfortable in the hushed sanctuary of the darkroom, watching images bloom to life in chemical baths, than I was in the boisterous, sun-drenched world of campus social life. My world was one of shades and subtleties, of capturing moments rather than participating in them. I saw life through a viewfinder, always at a slight remove, composing the chaos into something manageable, something beautiful but separate. Julian was the chaos. He was the sun. He was the captain of the soccer team, a software engineering prodigy who seemed to navigate the complex social architecture of university with an effortless grace. People were drawn to him, not just because he was handsome in that classically athletic, easy-smiling way, but because he radiated a genuine warmth, an uncomplicated kindness that felt rare and precious. He was the guy everyone knew, the one whose name was a currency of popularity. Girls developed legendary crushes on him. Guys wanted to be his friend. Professors saw in him a bright, limitless future. He was, for all intents and purposes, a golden boy, bathed in a perpetual light that seemed to leave no room for shadows. Our meeting was an accident of university housing. We were assigned as roommates in our sophomore year, a pairing that, on paper, made absolutely no sense. I remember seeing his name on the door, Julian Vance, and then seeing him, all broad shoulders and bright, confident eyes, dropping a duffel bag overflowing with soccer gear onto the floor of our tiny, cinder block room. My first thought was one of pure, unadulterated dread. This was my worst nightmare, being forced into close proximity with the human embodiment of everything I was not. I had my cameras, my books, my stacks of black and white prints. He had trophies, an endless parade of friends who would spill into our space, and a social calendar that looked like a military campaign. I prepared myself for a year of hiding in the library, of retreating so far into myself that I would become little more than a ghost who paid half the rent. But Julian, in his uniquely Julian way, refused to let that happen. He didn't see my quietness as a judgment or my introversion as a flaw. He saw it, it seemed, as a curiosity. He would come back from practice, sweaty and exhausted, and instead of just collapsing, he would ask about the photographs I was pinning to my corkboard. He didn't just say they were cool, he would point to a specific one, a shot of an old woman's hands, wrinkled and mapped with life, clutching a rosary, and he would ask what her story was. He looked at my work not as a hobby, but as a language, and he genuinely wanted to learn how to read it. He was fascinated by the way I saw the world, the details I chose to isolate and preserve. Slowly, painstakingly, the wall I had built around myself began to crumble. It wasn't a dramatic demolition, it was a gradual erosion, worn down by his persistent, gentle curiosity. He would drag me out for late-night food, insisting that my diet couldn't consist solely of darkroom fume-infused coffee. He would sit on his bed, coding for hours, while I sat at my desk, editing photos, the two of us existing in a comfortable, productive silence that was more companionable than any conversation I'd ever had. He respected the boundaries of my solitude, yet somehow managed to make me feel less alone within it. He created a space where I didn't have to pretend to be more outgoing, more like him. He just let me be me. And in that acceptance, a deep and abiding friendship took root. And with that friendship, something else began to grow within me, a secret garden I tended to in the most hidden corners of my heart. It started as admiration, a simple appreciation for his kindness and his light, but it deepened, mutated, bloomed into something more potent and dangerous. I fell in love with the way his brow furrowed when he was concentrating on a line of code, the way he'd absent-mindedly run a hand through his already messy hair. I fell in love with the sound of his laugh, a full-throated, honest thing that could fill a room. I fell in love with his unwavering loyalty, the way he'd defend a friend with a quiet ferocity that was startling in someone so easygoing. It was a hopeless, silent affliction. Julian was, as far as the entire world and I knew, completely and utterly straight. He dated, of course. There was a succession of bright, pretty girls who fit into his world as perfectly as I didn't. They were cheerleaders, sorority presidents, fellow student athletes. I watched from the sidelines, the faithful friend, the quiet observer, my camera lens a shield between my heart and the painful reality. I became his confidant. I was the one he came to when he had a fight with a girlfriend, the one who helped him pick out birthday presents, the one who listened. I played my part so well that no one, least of all him, ever suspected the truth. My love was a photograph taken on a faulty roll of film, an image that existed only in my mind, never to be developed, never to be seen. It was a secret I planned to take with me to the grave, the price I paid for the privilege of his friendship. The thought of losing him, of shattering the beautiful, easy thing we had built by confessing the messy, complicated truth of my feelings, was a terror far greater than the quiet ache of my unrequited love. So I stayed silent. For years. After college, we moved into a 2-bedroom apartment together. It was a natural progression, an unspoken assumption. Our lives had become so intertwined that the thought of living apart felt strange, like a phantom limb. He was working for a big tech firm, climbing the corporate ladder with the same apparent ease he'd climbed the social one. I was a freelance photographer, piecing together a living from weddings, portraits, and the occasional gallery show of my personal work. Our apartment became an extension of our college dorm room, just with better furniture and less cinder block. It was our shared space, our sanctuary from the demands of the outside world. He had his life, populated by work colleagues and old college teammates, and I had mine, a smaller, quieter circle of fellow artists. But at the end of the day, we always came back to the apartment, to the familiar rhythm of our shared existence. And then came Clara. She was different from the college girlfriends. She was a lawyer, sharp and ambitious and beautiful in a way that felt serious and adult. Julian fell for her, hard. For 3 years, she was a constant presence in our apartment, in our lives. I did what I always did. I retreated, I observed, I played the part of the supportive friend. I learned to like Clara, and I think she, in her own way, learned to tolerate me, the quiet, ever-present roommate who seemed to share a secret language with her boyfriend. I photographed their engagement party. I framed the shot of them, laughing, their heads close together, and I gave it to them for Christmas. I built a fortress of normalcy around my heart, brick by painful brick. I told myself that his happiness was my happiness. I almost believed it. The shift began not with a bang, but with a profound and unnerving silence. It started the day Clara moved her things out. I had made myself scarce, hiding out in a coffee shop for hours, giving them the space to perform the grim surgery of their separation. When I finally returned, the apartment felt hollowed out, echoing with the absence of her things. Julian was sitting on the couch in the near dark, staring at the empty space on the wall where a painting of hers used to hang. He didn't look sad, not in the way I'd seen him look after petty fights. He looked erased, as if she hadn't just taken her belongings, but had taken a fundamental part of him, too. He didn't want to talk about it, not really. He answered my tentative questions with monosyllabic grunts. "Are you okay?" I'd ask. "Fine," he'd reply, his eyes fixed on the television screen, though I knew he wasn't seeing it. The easy camaraderie that had defined our friendship for a decade evaporated, replaced by a tense, fragile quiet. He started working longer hours, coming home late and heading straight to his room. The door, which for years had always been left at least partially open in a silent invitation, was now firmly, unequivocally closed. It was a statement, a boundary drawn where one had never been needed before. It felt like he was shutting me out along with the rest of the world. The loneliness of those first few weeks was a physical presence in the apartment. It was a cold draft that snaked through the rooms, a fine layer of dust settling on surfaces that Clara would have kept pristine. I missed the sound of his key in the lock at a reasonable hour. I missed our easy, end-of-day debriefs. I missed him. The ache of my old, secret love, which had been dormant for so long, woke up, sharp and insistent. It was no longer just about wanting him. It was about watching him suffer from a distance, unable to reach him, separated by that closed door. I felt utterly helpless, a photographer with a broken camera, unable to capture or comprehend the image of the man dissolving in the room next to mine. Then, one night, about a month after the breakup, something changed. I was in the kitchen, making tea, when he emerged from his room. He looked awful. His eyes were red-rimmed, and the confident set of his shoulders had slumped into a question mark of defeat. He didn't say anything. He just walked over to the counter, leaned against it, and watched me. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. I finished making my tea, my hands trembling slightly. I poured a second mug, slid it across the granite towards him. He looked down at the mug, then up at me. His eyes, for the first time in weeks, actually focused on me. "I can't sleep," he said, his voice rough, as if he hadn't used it in days. "I'm sorry," I said, the words feeling small and inadequate. "It's the quiet," he said, and the admission seemed to cost him something. "It's too quiet in my room." That was the crack in the dam. It was the first honest thing he'd said since Clara left. He wasn't fine, he was adrift in a sea of silence, and he was drowning. I suggested a movie, something loud and stupid, a distraction. He agreed with a nod that was more of a collapse. And so, the ritual began. It started that night, with him on the far end of the couch and me on the other, a no-man's land of cushions between us. He fell asleep halfway through the first car chase, his head lolling against the armrest at an uncomfortable angle. I watched him for a long time, the hard lines of his face softened in sleep, looking younger, more vulnerable than I had ever seen him. I eventually got up, draped a blanket over him, and went to my own room, my own quiet, lonely bed. The next night, he didn't even wait for me to suggest it. He came out of his room as I was cleaning up after dinner and just said, "Movie." It became our new normal. Every night, we would retreat to the living room, to the soft glow of the television. We rarely spoke. The movies were the soundtrack to our shared solitude. For the first week, the pillow barrier remained. It was my defense mechanism, a physical manifestation of the boundary I was desperate to maintain between my feelings and our friendship. It was a way of telling myself that this was just two friends hanging out, nothing more. He was grieving. I was being supportive. It was all perfectly platonic. But the space between us began to feel less like a buffer and more like a void. I could feel his loneliness radiating from his side of the couch, a cold front that battled with the warmth of my own secret yearning. I watched him out of the corner of my eye, saw the way his fingers would drum restlessly on his leg, the way he'd clench and unclench his jaw. He was a man vibrating with an unspoken need for comfort, for contact, for something to anchor him in the storm of his own head. I knew, with a terrifying certainty, what he needed, and I knew I was the only one there to give it. The question that haunted my waking and sleeping hours was what it would cost me if I did. That was the landscape. That was the fragile, tense ecosystem of our apartment on the night he finally crossed the divide. When he dismantled the pillow wall, it wasn't just an act of moving cushions. It was the tearing down of a treaty, the rewriting of a constitution that had governed our friendship for a decade. When his head came to rest on my shoulder, it was a white flag, a surrender to a need that was greater than his pride, greater than the unspoken rules. And for me, sitting there, my body rigid with shock and a wild, soaring hope, it felt like he had just handed me a lit stick of dynamite. I could either throw it away and watch our friendship survive, scorched but intact, or I could hold on to it and risk letting it blow my entire world to pieces for the chance, the infinitesimally small chance, that what bloomed from the wreckage might be something more beautiful than anything I had ever dared to imagine. The first time his head landed on my shoulder, my entire nervous system went into a state of emergency. It was a 5-alarm fire of sensation and panic. Every point of contact was a supernova. The weight of his head, heavier than I would have imagined. The texture of his hair, surprisingly soft, brushing against my cheek. The scent of him, not cologne, but something more fundamental. The faint, clean smell of his shampoo and the unique, warm scent that was just Julian. My mind, usually a quiet gallery of images and observations, became a cacophony of warring voices. One screamed at me to move, to pull away, to reestablish the boundary before it was too late. Another, a quieter, more treacherous voice, whispered at me to stay, to lean into it, to savor this impossible, fragile moment of closeness. I chose paralysis. I did nothing. I simply sat there, my posture unnaturally stiff, my breathing shallow, as if the slightest movement might startle him away. The action movie on the screen became a meaningless blur of explosions and shouting. The only reality was the solid, breathing weight of Julian against me. He shifted slightly in his sleep, a soft murmur escaping his lips, and burrowed his face more firmly into the crook of my neck. And that's when the panic began to subside, replaced by a feeling so profound and overwhelming it almost brought tears to my eyes. It was a tidal wave of tenderness. He felt safe with me. In the wreckage of his life, in the depths of his loneliness, he had sought out me for comfort. He had crossed the room, dismantled the barriers, and chosen my shoulder as his harbor. The thought was so staggering, so humbling, that it eclipsed my fear. For the first time, my secret love didn't feel like a burden or a sickness. It felt like a quiet strength, a silent, sturdy place for him to rest. He slept like that for over an hour in which I memorized every detail of the experience. I studied the way the blue light from the television traced the curve of his ear, the way his eyelashes, dark and surprisingly long, rested against his cheek. I listened to the rhythm of his breathing, the soft, even cadence of a body finally at peace. It was the most intimate experience of my life, more intimate than any touch I had ever shared with another person, because it was so utterly unguarded. He was completely vulnerable, and he had trusted me with that vulnerability. When the movie ended and the credits rolled, casting the room into a deeper darkness, I knew I couldn't just leave him there. Very, very slowly, as if handling a priceless, sleeping artifact. I shifted my weight, trying to ease him into a more comfortable position against the back of the couch. He stirred, his eyes fluttering open for a second. They were unfocused, clouded with sleep. He looked at me, not with surprise, but with a kind of drowsy recognition. "Leo," he mumbled, his voice thick. "Hey," I whispered back, my voice barely a sound. "You fell asleep." He just nodded, his eyes closing again. He didn't move away. He didn't seem to register that he was using my body as a pillow. He just settled back in, accepting the contact as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I sat with him for another 20 minutes, my heart a slow, steady drum now, before I dared to speak again. "Julian," I whispered, "come on. You should go to bed." He made a protesting noise, a low groan from deep in his chest. "Scomfortable here," he slurred. My breath hitched. Comfortable. He was comfortable. With me. Like this. The word echoed in the silent apartment. I swallowed hard against the lump in my throat. "Your back will kill you in the morning," I reasoned, clinging to the practical, the mundane. "Let's get you to your room." It took some coaxing, but he finally allowed me to help him up. He was unsteady on his feet, heavy with sleep, and he leaned on me as we walked the few steps down the short hallway to his bedroom. I had to hold him up, my arm around his waist, his arms slung over my shoulders. It was a parody of a drunken walk home from a bar, but it was freighted with a decade of unspoken things. His door was ajar, just as he'd left it. I guided him inside, into the darkness of his room, and helped him sit on the edge of his bed. He just sat there, swaying slightly. I reached over and switched on his bedside lamp. The soft, yellow light filled the space, revealing a room that was neat but sterile, stripped of Clara's personality. He looked up at me, and in the warm glow of the lamp, his eyes were clear. The sleepiness was gone, replaced by an expression I couldn't read. It was raw and open and profoundly sad. "Thanks, Leo," he said, his voice quiet and sober now. "Anytime," I said, the word feeling both true and hopelessly inadequate. I hovered in the doorway, unsure of what the protocol was now. Should I leave? Say goodnight? He hadn't let go of my hand, which I only just realized he'd been holding since I helped him off the couch. His grip was loose, but it was there. He looked at our joined hands, then back at my face. An entire conversation seemed to pass between us in that silent look. It was a conversation about loneliness and fear and the terrifying comfort of another person's presence. Then he did something that stopped my heart. He brought my hand to his cheek, pressing my palm against the rough stubble of his jaw. He closed his eyes and just held it there, breathing in and out, a slow, deliberate rhythm. It wasn't a romantic gesture. It wasn't passionate. It was something more elemental. It was a man seeking warmth, a drowning sailor clinging to a piece of driftwood. I stood there, frozen, letting him hold my hand against his face, my thumb resting just below his eye. I could feel the dampness of a tear he hadn't let fall. After a long moment, he released my hand, the loss of contact a sudden cold shock. "Good night, Leo," he whispered, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Good night, Julian," I whispered back. I pulled his door almost completely shut, but I left it open a crack. I didn't know why. It felt like a response, a signal, a silent acknowledgement that the solid, sealed-off boundary between us had been breached. I went back to my room and lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling, my hand still tingling where it had touched his skin. The ritual had begun, but it had also escalated, transformed. It was no longer just about falling asleep on the couch. It was about a deliberate, conscious seeking of contact, and I was terrified of where it was leading. The next night, there was no pretense. No movie was suggested. After dinner, as we were clearing the plates, he just looked at me, a silent question in his exhausted eyes. I nodded, and we migrated to the living room. This time, he didn't even bother with the far side of the couch. He sat down next to me, leaving only a few inches of space between us, a respectable distance. But as the evening wore on, as the ambient sounds of the city outside our window filled the quiet room, the space between us began to shrink. It was a slow, almost imperceptible drift, a gravitational pull. His leg would brush against mine, and instead of pulling away, he would just leave it there. Then, an hour or so in, he sighed, the same soul-weary sound as the night before, and leaned over, resting his head not on my shoulder, but directly in my lap. This was different. This was a new level of surrender, a new degree of trust. My lap, the intimacy of it was breathtaking. I froze, my entire body going rigid. My hands hovered in the air, uncertain of their purpose. What was I supposed to do? Where was I supposed to put them? He was so still, his breathing so even, that I thought he might have fallen asleep instantly. I rested one hand on the back of the couch, the other on my own knee, trying to appear casual, relaxed, as if this were a completely normal occurrence. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Then, he spoke, his voice muffled by my jeans. "Is this okay?" The question hung in the air, fragile and heavy. It was the first time he had acknowledged the strangeness of it, the first time he had asked for permission. It changed everything. This was no longer just him unconsciously seeking comfort in his sleep. This was a conscious choice. He was awake. He was aware. And he was asking. My voice, when it came, was a reedy whisper. "Yes," I said. "It's okay." As soon as the word left my lips, I felt him relax, a subtle but definite release of tension in his body. He let out a long, slow breath, and it was as if he had been holding it for weeks. Emboldened by his question and my answer, I slowly, tentatively, lowered my hand from the back of the couch and placed it on his back, between his shoulder blades. I felt the solid, warm muscle beneath his shirt. I expected him to flinch, to tense up again. He did the opposite. He seemed to lean into my touch, a barely perceptible shift. So I rested my hand there. And then I started to move it, tracing slow, meaningless circles on his back. We stayed like that for what felt like an eternity. No television, no music, just the sound of our breathing in the dim light of the living room. My hand never stopped its slow, circular motion. It was a silent, rhythmic reassurance. "You're here. You're safe. I'm here." After a long time, I risked moving my other hand, the one that had been clenched on my own leg. I brought it up to his head and gently, hesitantly, began to run my fingers through his hair. It was as soft as I had imagined. He made a soft, contented sound in his throat, a sound of pure comfort, and I felt my own anxieties begin to melt away, replaced by that same, overwhelming tenderness from the night before. This was our new ritual. Every night, we would finish our evening chores, and then he would come and lie down, his head in my lap. And I would hold him. I would run my fingers through his hair, or trace patterns on his back, or just rest my hand on his shoulder. We rarely spoke during these times. The silence was no longer empty or tense. It was full. It was a language of its own, a language of touch and trust and shared vulnerability. I was his charging station. I was the place he came to plug in and replenish the energy that the world, and his own grief, drained from him each day. During the day, we were back to being Leo and Julian, the roommates. We'd talk about work, about bills, about what to get for groceries. We were normal. But there was a new awareness between us, a low hum of electricity beneath the surface of our mundane interactions. I would catch him looking at me from across the room with that same raw, unreadable expression I'd seen in his bedroom. His eyes held a mixture of gratitude and confusion, and something else, something deeper that I was too afraid to name. He started leaving his bedroom door open again. Not wide open, but always ajar, a silent invitation that I never accepted, but whose meaning I understood completely. My own inner world was in turmoil. I was living a double life. By day, I was the stoic, supportive friend. By night, I was holding the man I loved, indulging in a form of intimacy I had never dreamed possible. It was both heaven and hell. Heaven because he was there, in my arms, trusting me, needing me. Hell because I knew it was all built on a foundation of his grief and my silence. I was terrified of what would happen when he started to heal. When he no longer needed me as a crutch, would he look back on these nights with embarrassment or even disgust? Would the memory of this intimacy shatter the friendship I had so carefully preserved for a decade? I became a hypervigilant observer, an analyst of micro-expressions and subtle shifts in tone. Every interaction was a clue to be deciphered. When his hand brushed mine as we both reached for the milk, was it an accident or something more? When he smiled at me in the morning, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes for the first time in weeks, was it a sign of his recovery or a sign of something growing between us? I was drowning in ambiguity. The photographer in me was desperate for a clear image, but all I had was a blur, a double exposure of friendship and something that felt dangerously like love. One night, about 2 months into our nightly ritual, something shifted again. He was lying with his head in my lap as usual, and I was running my hand over his hair. He was quieter than usual, a different kind of quiet. Not peaceful, but tense. I could feel it in the rigid line of his shoulders. The way his breathing was just a little too controlled. "What's wrong?" I asked softly. He was silent for a long time. I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, he spoke, his voice low and strained. "I saw Clara today." My hand froze in his hair. My whole body went cold. "Oh," I said, the sound hollow. How was that?" "It was fine," he said, but the word was brittle. "We met for coffee, to exchange the last of our stuff." "It was civil." He shifted, turning his head so he could look up at me. His eyes were dark and turbulent, like a stormy sea. "It felt like closing a book," he said. "Like, for good. I thought I'd be sadder, or angry, or something, but I just felt empty." He held my gaze, and I felt like he was seeing straight through me, into the frantic, terrified core of me. And then, he continued, his voice dropping even lower. "All I could think about was coming home." He paused, and the weight of that pause was immense. "To this." My heart stopped. He wasn't just coming home to the apartment. He was coming home to this. To our ritual. To me. The implication was terrifying and exhilarating. He was no longer just running from his grief. He was running to something. He was running to me. He must have seen the panic and the hope warring on my face, because he reached up and took the hand that was resting on his chest. He laced his fingers through mine, his grip firm, deliberate. It wasn't the seeking of warmth touch from his bedroom. This was different. This was a connection. "Leo," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "What is this?" And there it was. The question. The one I had been dreading and longing for in equal measure. The question that would force the blur into focus, for better or for worse. I had no answer. Or rather, I had 1,000 answers, all of them too dangerous to speak aloud. This is me loving you for 10 years. This is me breaking my own heart every night by holding you. This is a mistake. This is the only thing that feels real. I couldn't say any of that. So I just looked down at him, at our intertwined hands, at his face, so open and vulnerable and confused, and I told him the only truth I could manage. "I don't know, Julian," I whispered. "I don't know." He held my gaze for another long moment, his thumb stroking the back of my hand. He didn't seem disappointed by my non-answer. He seemed relieved, as if my not knowing gave him permission to not know either. He brought our joined hands to his lips and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to my knuckles. Then he turned his face back into my lap, his hands still holding mine, and a different kind of silence settled over us. It wasn't the silence of comfort or the silence of tension. It was the silence of anticipation, the quiet, humming air before a storm finally breaks. We were standing on a precipice, together, and for the first time, I felt like we might be about to jump, not fall. The kiss on my knuckles was a new demarcation line. The ritual had always existed in a space of plausible deniability. He was grieving. He needed comfort. I was a good friend. But that single, deliberate act of affection was different. It was an acknowledgement. It was a gesture that couldn't be easily explained away by grief. It was a small, quiet question mark he had placed directly onto my skin, and it lingered there, a phantom touch that followed me through the subsequent days. The ambiguity I had been drowning in had somehow become even deeper, but now it was laced with a terrifying thread of possibility. The subtext of our nightly routine had become the text. We both knew something was happening, even if neither of us was brave enough to name it. The tension in the apartment became a living entity. It was in the way our eyes would meet for a fraction too long over the breakfast table. It was in the careful choreography of our movements in the narrow kitchen, the way we would both suck in our breath when our arms brushed. The air between us felt charged, humming with unspoken words and hesitant desires. The nights on the couch evolved. He still rested his head in my lap, but now our hands would almost always find each other, our fingers lacing together in the dim light. Sometimes he would guide my other hand to his chest, placing it over his heart, and I would just hold it there, feeling the steady, strong beat beneath my palm. It felt like he was offering me access to his most vital, vulnerable self, asking me to feel the rhythm of his life. My internal monologue was a constant, frantic negotiation. I was a photographer trying to frame an impossible shot, one that kept shifting and changing before I could get it in focus. Was this real? Was I inventing it? Was he simply transferring his need for intimacy from Clara to the nearest available person, and was I just a convenient, temporary placeholder? That fear was a cold, sharp stone in my gut. The thought that this was all just a transitional phase for him, a bridge he was using to get from one side of his life to the other, was a unique form of torture. I was the bridge, and I was terrified of the day he would reach the other side and walk away without a backward glance. Yet, the tenderness of our nights felt too genuine to be a simple act of transference. The way he would look at me before he settled down, a look of such profound trust and gratitude, felt real. The way his body would relax completely under my touch, the way he seemed to drink in the comfort I offered, felt real. I was caught in a paradox, simultaneously believing in the sincerity of these moments and being utterly convinced they were an illusion I was co-creating out of my own desperate longing. My decade of loving him from a safe distance had not prepared me for this proximity, for this agonizing, beautiful hope. The crossing happened on a rainy Saturday. The city was gray and washed out, the sound of water drumming against the window panes a constant, soothing rhythm. We had spent the day in a state of comfortable, domestic quiet. We didn't go out. We read on opposite ends of the couch, ordered takeout, and just existed in the space together. There was no pretense of a movie that night. As darkness fell, he simply moved over, laid his head in my lap, and took my hand. The rain was our soundtrack. We lay like that for hours, not speaking. I was tracing the lines on his palm with my thumb, a mindless, repetitive gesture. He was unnervingly still. I could feel the tension coiled in him again. But it was different from the night he had seen Clara. This was a nervous energy, a humming wire of anticipation. I could feel it in the slight tremor in the hand that held mine. My own anxiety rose to meet his. The air in the room grew thick, heavy with everything we had never said. It felt like we were approaching a summit we had been climbing for months. Finally, he broke the silence. He shifted, lifting his head from my lap and sitting up to face me. The sudden loss of his weight was a shock. The couch felt vast and empty between us. He didn't move away. He just sat there, cross-legged, so that our knees were touching. The dim light from the street lamp outside cast his face in shadows and soft highlights, like one of the portraits I loved to take. His eyes, fixed on mine, were dark and serious. "Leo," he started, his voice low and unsteady. He swallowed, as if gathering his courage. "I need to. I can't keep doing this." A cold dread washed over me. This was it. This was the moment he was going to end it. He was going to say it was weird, that he was sorry, that he had been using me, that we needed to go back to being just friends. The bridge was collapsing. I braced myself for the impact, my heart clenching into a tight, painful knot. I tried to school my features into a mask of neutral understanding, the mask I had worn for 10 years. "Okay," I managed to say, my voice a stranger's. He shook his head, a quick, frustrated gesture. "No, not like that. I don't want to stop." He ran a hand through his hair, a classic Julian gesture of anxiety. I can't keep doing this in-between thing. This not knowing what this is." He looked down at his hands, then back up at me, his expression one of pure, desperate vulnerability. "It's not fair to you." "It's okay," I said automatically, the words of a lifelong people-pleaser, a lifelong hider. "No, it's not," he insisted, his voice gaining a new intensity. Leo, you are the kindest, most patient person I have ever known. You let me fall apart, and you just held me. You didn't ask for anything. You just gave." He took a shaky breath. "For months, I've been so lost. And every night, coming here," he gestured to the space between us on the couch. "This has been the only thing that felt real, the only thing that made sense. The only place I felt safe." My carefully constructed mask was cracking. His words were dismantling my defenses, brick by brick. "But it's not just about feeling safe anymore," he continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "At first, maybe it was. But it's not now. Now, when I'm at work, I'm just thinking about coming home to you. When I wake up in the morning, the first person I want to see is you." He looked at me, his eyes pleading for me to understand. "I don't just feel safe with you, Leo. I don't know what I feel. It's new. It's more." He fell silent, leaving the word "more" hanging in the air between us, a fragile, shimmering thing. My mind was reeling. He was saying the things I had only ever dreamed of hearing. But the fear, the ingrained habit of self-protection, was still there. What if he was just confused? What if he was mistaking gratitude for something else? He must have seen the doubt in my eyes. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before he cupped my jaw, his thumb stroking my cheek. His touch was electric, a jolt that shot through my entire body. It wasn't the touch of a friend seeking comfort. It was the touch of a man reaching for something he wanted. "Leo," he whispered, his face so close now I could feel his breath on my lips. "I'm so scared of getting this wrong, of ruining everything." And in that moment, seeing his fear mirroring my own, something inside me finally broke free. My own terror receded, replaced by a fierce, protective surge of emotion for this man, this beautiful, confused, wonderful man who was just as lost as I was. "Me too," I breathed, the confession a release of a decade's worth of pressure. A flicker of something, relief, recognition, passed through his eyes. He searched my face for another second, looking for a sign, for permission. And then, he asked the question that changed the world. "Would it be okay," he whispered, his voice trembling slightly, "if I kissed you?" It wasn't a demand. It wasn't a confident move. It was a plea. It was the most vulnerable, honest, and respectful question I had ever been asked. He was giving me all the power. He was laying his heart at my feet and asking me what to do with it. All my fears, all my doubts, all my carefully constructed walls, they all dissolved into nothing in the face of that one, simple, beautiful question. I didn't answer with words. I couldn't. I just closed the small distance between us and pressed my lips to his. It was the softest of kisses. It was tentative, exploratory, a question and an answer all at once. It wasn't about passion or lust. It was about recognition. It was the feeling of coming home after a lifetime of being lost. His lips were as soft as I had imagined, and they trembled slightly against mine. He made a small sound, a sigh of surrender that I felt more than I heard. I brought my hand up to his neck, my fingers tangling in the soft hair at his nape, and he leaned into me, his own hands coming up to frame my face, holding me as if I were the most precious thing in the world. We stayed like that for a long time, just a gentle, chaste pressing of lips, learning the shape and feel of each other. When we finally pulled apart, it was only by an inch. We rested our foreheads together, our breath mingling in the small space between us. The sound of the rain outside was the only sound in the universe. "Okay," I whispered, echoing his question back to him. He let out a shaky laugh, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief. "Yeah," he breathed. "More than okay." He kissed me again, and this time it was deeper, more confident, but still imbued with that same sense of wonder and reverence. It was a kiss that tasted of rainy nights and unspoken confessions and 10 years of waiting. It was the end of the ritual of the couch and the beginning of everything else. In the quiet of the apartment, with the rain as our witness, the blur finally snapped into focus. The picture was clear, and it was more beautiful than I had ever dared to hope. The aftermath of a dream realized is often stranger and more disorienting than the dream itself. In the immediate moments after the kiss, everything felt crystalline, perfect. We didn't talk much more that night. Words felt clumsy and inadequate after what had passed between us. We simply held each other, trading soft, exploratory kisses, rediscovering the landscape of each other's faces with our fingertips. Eventually, we fell asleep on the couch, tangled together, my head on his chest, his arms wrapped securely around me. For the first time, it wasn't about comfort or grief. It was about possession, in the gentlest sense of the word. It was a mutual claiming. I fell asleep feeling, for the first time in my life, completely and utterly found. But the morning brought with it the harsh, unforgiving light of reality. I woke up first, still wrapped in his arms. The early sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the dust motes and the messy evidence of our takeout dinner from the night before. In the light of day, everything felt different. Julian was still asleep, his face peaceful, his breathing even. But the certainty of the night before began to fray at the edges, replaced by the familiar, cold tendrils of anxiety. What had we done? What did this mean? He was Julian, the golden boy, the one who dated women like Clara. I was Leo, his quiet, constant, platonic friend. Had a rainy night and a moment of intense emotional vulnerability fundamentally changed who he was? Or had he just made a mistake, one he would wake up to regret with a soul-crushing clarity? I carefully extricated myself from his arms, my movements slow and deliberate, as if defusing a bomb. He stirred but didn't wake. I escaped to the kitchen, my heart pounding a frantic, fearful rhythm. I made coffee, the familiar ritual of flimsy anchor in a sea of uncertainty. I watched the dark liquid drip into the pot, and I felt like I was watching my own hope drain away. He had been emotional. He had been grieving. He had been lonely. I had been there. It was a perfect storm of circumstance. It didn't mean he was in love with me. It didn't even mean he was gay. It just meant he was human and confused. The photographer in me, the ruthless observer, was back, analyzing the scene with a cold, detached logic, and the conclusion it reached was terrifying. When he finally emerged from the living room, he looked as disoriented as I felt. He ran a hand through his sleep-messed hair and blinked against the morning light. Our eyes met across the kitchen, and in that instant, I saw it. The panic, the confusion, the regret. It was a subtle shift in his expression, a shuddering of the openness that had been there the night before. But to me, it was as loud as a scream. The beautiful, clear image from last night was already starting to blur, to fade. "Hey," he said, his voice husky with sleep, but strained. "Coffee's ready," I replied, my own voice artificially bright. I busied myself with pouring 2 mugs, keeping my back to him, unable to bear the look on his face. The silence was deafening. It was the old silence, the bad silence from the weeks after Clara left, but 100 times worse. Before, it had been filled with his grief. Now, it was filled with us, with the memory of what we had done. He took the mug I offered, his fingers brushing mine. We both flinched, pulling back as if burned. The casual, easy touch that had defined our friendship for a decade was suddenly fraught, a minefield of new meaning. "I have to, get some work done today," he mumbled, not meeting my eyes. Big deadline. It was a lie. I knew his work schedule as well as my own. His weekends were almost always free. It was an excuse, a retreat. He was building a wall, and he was doing it with a speed and efficiency that was devastating to watch. "Okay," I said, my voice small. "Sure." He took his coffee and disappeared into his room. And this time, I heard the click of the lock. The sound of that lock was the sound of my heart breaking. The door, which had been ajar for months, a symbol of our growing intimacy, was now sealed. It was a definitive, brutal statement. He was locking me out. He was locking us out. I stood in the kitchen for a long time, my own mug growing cold in my hands, and I felt a fool. The biggest, most hopeful fool in the entire world. I had allowed myself to believe, for a few precious hours, that the fantasy I had harbored for a decade could be real. And now, the morning had come, and the dream had dissipated like mist. The next few days were a special kind of hell. We lived in the same apartment, but we might as well have been on different continents. We were ghosts in each other's lives. We moved around each other with a careful, painful choreography of avoidance. If I was in the kitchen, he would stay in his room. If he was in the living room, I would find something to do in mine. We communicated through brief, polite text messages about bills or groceries. The couch, our sacred space, sat empty, a silent, mocking monument to what we had shared and what I had apparently ruined. The nightly ritual was dead. The evenings were the worst. The silence in the apartment was a physical weight, pressing down on me, suffocating me. I would sit alone on the couch, staring at the blank television screen, hyper-aware of his presence behind his locked door. Was he in there regretting it? Was he disgusted with himself? With me? The uncertainty was eating me alive. My love, which had once been a quiet, manageable ache, had become an open, gaping wound. And the salt in that wound was that he had been the one to kiss me. He had been the one to ask. He had led me to the edge of the cliff, and now it felt as if he had pushed me off and then walked away. The frustration began to curdle the hurt. I was hurt, yes, devastatingly so, but I was also getting angry. Angry at him for his cowardice, for his inability to face what had happened, and angry at myself for being so passive, for allowing him to dictate the terms of our silence, just as I had allowed him to dictate the terms of our intimacy. I had spent 10 years being the quiet observer, the passive recipient of his friendship. I had let him set the pace, and now he had run away, leaving me stranded. The pattern had to break. I couldn't live in this limbo, this purgatory of polite avoidance. I needed to know. Even if the truth was the worst thing I could imagine, it had to be better than this suffocating silence. After nearly a week of this silent torture, I made a decision. I was done waiting. I was done being the passive observer in my own life. I was going to force the confrontation. That evening, I didn't retreat to the couch. I waited. I stood in the hallway, my heart pounding, my palms sweating. I felt like I was about to step onto a stage without having learned any of my lines. When he finally emerged from his room, heading for the kitchen, he stopped dead when he saw me standing there, blocking his path. Surprise, then alarm, flickered across his face. "Leo," he said, his voice wary. "Everything okay?" "No," I said, and the simple, honest words seemed to startle him. "Nothing is okay, Julian. We need to talk." He flinched, his gaze darting around as if looking for an escape route. "I'm kind of busy." "No, you're not." I cut him off, my voice sharper than I intended. "You're not busy. You're hiding. And I'm done with it. I'm done living with a ghost." He looked genuinely taken aback by my tone. He had never heard me speak to him like this. I had always been the gentle one, the accommodating one. The anger in my voice seemed to snap him out of his evasive fog. He leaned against the wall, crossing his arms over his chest, a defensive posture. "What do you want me to say, Leo?" he asked, his voice low and miserable. "I want you to say something," I exclaimed, my frustration boiling over. "Anything. I want you to tell me what the hell is going on in your head. I want you to look at me, for God's sake." He finally lifted his gaze and met mine. His eyes were a mess of confusion, fear, and a deep, profound sadness. "I don't know what's going on in my head," he admitted, his voice cracking. "That's the problem. Everything is a mess. So talk to me about the mess." I pleaded, my anger softening into desperation. "Don't just lock yourself in your room and pretend I don't exist. Don't you think I deserve more than that? After everything." I gestured vaguely towards the living room, towards the couch. "After that night." He winced at the mention of it. "I'm sorry," he whispered, looking at the floor. "Leo, I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have. It was a mistake." The words hit me like a physical blow. A mistake. My worst fear, spoken aloud. I felt the blood drain from my face. "A mistake," I repeated, my voice flat, devoid of all emotion. "Was it a mistake when you put your head on my shoulder? Was it a mistake every night for 2 months when you let me hold you? Was it a mistake when you asked if you could kiss me? Which part was the mistake, Julian? Or was it all just one big, convenient mistake for you?" He looked up, his face stricken. "No, it's not like that. It wasn't convenient," he struggled for words, his usual eloquence completely deserting him. "I don't know how to explain it. When I'm with you, when we were like that, everything feels right. It's the only thing that's felt right in so long. It's quiet. It's calm. It's you. And then the sun comes up. I finished for him, my voice bitter. And you remember that you're Julian Vance, and I'm just Leo, and this isn't who you're supposed to be. Is that it? He didn't deny it. He just stared at me, his face a mask of misery. And in his silence, I had my answer. It was worse than him being disgusted. He wasn't disgusted. He was terrified. Terrified of what it meant that he felt right with me. Terrified of the implications. He had kissed me, and it had felt right, and that had scared him so badly that he had run and hidden, locking the door on the feeling and on me. I've loved you for 10 years, I said, the words falling out of me, quiet and heavy and final. There was no point in hiding anymore. The fortress was already in ruins. I have sat by and watched you live your life, and I have never, ever said a word. I have valued your friendship more than my own happiness. And for one night, I let myself believe that maybe I could have both. I took a ragged breath, the confession leaving me feeling hollowed out and strangely calm. I can live with you not loving me back, Julian. I've been doing it for a decade, but I can't live like this. I can't live with you looking at me like I'm a mistake you made. I can't be your dirty secret. Tears were silently tracking down his face now. He didn't even seem to notice them. He just watched me, his expression shattered. He finally uncrossed his arms and took a hesitant step towards me. Leo, he whispered, his voice thick with tears. You're not a mistake. You're the furthest thing from a mistake. You're my best friend. I know, I said, my own eyes burning. That's what makes this so much harder. I'm just scared, he confessed, his voice breaking. I don't know who I am if I'm not the person everyone thinks I am. I don't know what this means, he gestured between us, a helpless, lost motion. And I'm so scared of hurting you. I look at you, and I see how much I've already hurt you this week, and it's killing me. I'm a coward. The confession, the raw honesty of it, pierced through my anger and my hurt. He wasn't a monster. He wasn't cruel. He was just a man, terrified and lost, grappling with a fundamental shift in his own identity. He was standing on the same precipice I was, only he had been pushed there without warning, while I had been staring at it for years. I didn't have a grand, comforting speech. I didn't have the answers he was looking for. All I had was the truth, and a decade of love that was, I realized in that moment, stronger than my fear. I closed the small space between us, and, for the first time, I was the one who initiated. I wrapped my arms around him, pulling him into a hug. He was stiff for a second, surprised, and then he just collapsed against me, burying his face in my shoulder, his body shaking with silent sobs. It was a mirror of all those nights on the couch, but this time, it was different. This wasn't about him seeking comfort and me providing it. This was two people, two equals, holding each other up in the wreckage. It's okay to be scared, I whispered into his hair, my own tears finally falling. I'm scared too, but you don't have to figure it all out right now. You just have to stop locking the door. He held me tighter, his arms a desperate band around my back. He didn't say anything. He just held on, as if I were the only solid thing in his spinning world. And in the quiet of our hallway, amidst the debris of our broken silence, we began, slowly and painfully, to find a new kind of foundation. Not one built on grief and plausible deniability, but on a shared, terrifying, and beautiful truth. The confrontation in the hallway didn't magically solve everything. It wasn't a neat and tidy conclusion where all fears were vanquished and a perfect, fully formed relationship emerged. It was more like the lancing of a wound. The immediate aftermath was painful and messy, but it was the first necessary step toward actual healing. We stood there for a long time, just holding each other, the tension of the past week draining out of us, replaced by a profound, shared exhaustion. The locked door to his room stood as a silent testament to the fear that had almost torn us apart, but now, with us standing together just outside it, it seemed to have lost its power. When we finally pulled apart, we were both a wreck. Our faces were tear-stained and blotchy, our eyes red. We probably looked ridiculous, but in that moment, I had never felt closer to him. The carefully maintained facades were gone. There was no more golden boy Julian or quiet observer Leo. There were just two people who had stripped each other down to their most vulnerable cores. He looked at me, really looked at me, and the guarded confusion was gone, replaced by a raw, fragile openness. "I'm so sorry, Leo," he whispered again, his voice hoarse. "For how I acted. For everything." "I know," I said softly. And I did. I saw his apology not just in his words, but in the shame and regret etched onto his face. We're both new at this. The word "this" hung in the air, still undefined, but now it felt less like a question mark and more like a space waiting to be filled. That night, there was no migration to the couch. The couch felt like it belonged to a different era, a different stage of our story. After our talk, a deep weariness settled over us. We ordered a pizza, and we ate it sitting on the floor of the living room, our backs against the sofa. We talked. For the first time, we really talked. He told me about the suffocating pressure he'd felt his whole life to be the person everyone expected, the athlete, the popular guy, the successful engineer with the perfect girlfriend. He spoke of his relationship with Clara not with lingering love, but as another role he had been playing, a costume he had worn because it fit the part. He admitted that the comfort he found with me was so terrifying because it was the first thing that had ever felt truly his, not something prescribed by the script of his life. I listened, and for the first time, I wasn't just observing. I was participating. I told him about the loneliness of my 10-year silence. I told him about the fear of losing his friendship, a fear so profound it had become the central organizing principle of my emotional life. I explained how his kindness, his acceptance of my quiet nature, was the very thing that had made me fall in love with him, and the very thing that made the thought of losing him unbearable. It was a conversation held in low voices, punctuated by long, thoughtful silences. It was the work of architects, clearing the rubble of a collapsed structure to see if the foundation was still sound enough to build upon. When it was late, and we were both talked out, a new, awkward question arose. Where to sleep? The thought of retreating to our separate rooms, back to the old geography of our platonic life, felt like a step backward. It felt like a denial of the new, fragile truth we had just unearthed. Julian was the one who voiced it, his gaze flickering towards his bedroom door, which was still ajar. I don't want to be alone tonight," he said, the admission quiet but firm. It wasn't a plea born of grief like before. It was a simple statement of desire. I just nodded, my throat tight with a feeling I couldn't name. It was hope, but it was a cautious, fragile hope, like the first green shoot pushing its way through frozen ground. We walked to his room together. He didn't lock the door. He didn't even close it all the way. He left it slightly open, a deliberate, symbolic act that spoke volumes. His room, which had been his fortress of solitude, was now our shared space. We climbed into his bed, a space that had once been so forbidden to my imagination that I had never even dared to picture it. We lay on our backs, side by side, not touching, staring up at the ceiling. The silence was different again. It wasn't tense or comfortable or anticipatory. It was reverent. We were in a new, holy space, and we were both afraid of making a wrong move. After a few minutes, I felt his hand move across the small space of sheet between us. His pinky finger brushed against mine. It was a small, tentative question. I answered by uncurling my own hand and lacing my fingers with his. He let out a long, slow breath, and I felt the tension leave his body. We fell asleep like that, hand in hand, two separate people choosing to be connected in the dark. The days that followed were a process of gentle, deliberate recalibration. We were learning a new language, a new way of being with each other. It was a dance of approach and retreat, but now the retreats were not born of fear, but of respect for each other's pace. We started to build a new set of rituals. Morning coffee was no longer a minefield, but a quiet, shared moment before the day began. He would lean against the counter while I prepared the mugs, and his hand would find its way to the small of my back, a simple, grounding touch that said, "I'm here. I'm still here." We reclaimed the couch. One evening, I was editing photos, and he came and sat beside me, not saying anything, just watching. After a while, he leaned his head on my shoulder, just as he had that first night. But this time, it was different. I didn't freeze. I didn't panic. I just leaned my own head against his and kept working. It was easy. It was natural. It was us. The comfort was no longer a one-way street. It was a circuit we completed together. The physical side of our relationship unfolded slowly, with a tenderness and patience that was, in itself, a form of love. Our intimacy was built on a foundation of whispers and questions. Can I kiss you? Is this okay? Can we just stay like this for a while? Every step forward was a mutual decision, a joint exploration. It was a stark contrast to the way he had been with Clara, a relationship I had observed as being full of grand, public gestures. Our relationship was being built in the opposite way, from the inside out, in quiet rooms, through small, private acts of devotion. He was still scared. I could see it sometimes, a flicker of the old panic in his eyes when he would catch a glimpse of our reflection in a window, as if surprised to see us standing together. He was dismantling a lifetime of self-perception, and it was not an easy or a linear process. There were days he was quiet and withdrawn, lost in his own head. But the difference now was that he didn't lock the door. He would come to me, lay his head in my lap, and just say, "I'm having a hard day," and I would just hold him, running my fingers through his hair, and I would understand. I was no longer just a source of comfort. I was his partner in his confusion, the safe harbor where he could be messy and uncertain without judgment. My own transformation was just as profound. The constant, low-level anxiety that had been my companion for a decade began to recede. The fear of him leaving, which had been a constant hum beneath the surface of my love, was replaced by a growing sense of security. I learned to trust the feeling of his hand in mine. I learned to believe the words he would whisper to me in the dark. "You make me feel like I can finally breathe." The photographer in me, who had always kept a professional distance from his subjects, began to put down the camera. I started to live in the moments, instead of just composing them. I was no longer the observer of Julian's life. I was an integral, essential part of it. About a month after our confrontation, we were lying in his bed on a Sunday morning, the sunlight streaming in. It had become our favorite place, a sanctuary within our sanctuary. I was propped up on some pillows, reading, and he was lying with his head on my stomach, tracing patterns on my arm. It was a scene of such perfect, quiet domesticity that it almost made my heart ache. "Leo," he said, his voice soft. I answered, not looking up from my book. "I love you." The words were so quiet, so simple, so devoid of drama, that I almost missed them. I froze, my eyes fixed on the page, the words blurring into meaningless shapes. I slowly lowered my book. He was looking up at me, his expression open and completely serious. There was no fear in his eyes. There was no confusion. There was just a calm, steady certainty. Tears welled in my eyes, hot and sudden. "I know," I whispered, a tear splashing onto his cheek. I love you too." "God, Julian, I've loved you for so long." He smiled, a slow, beautiful smile that lit up his entire face. He reached up and wiped the tear from his cheek with his thumb. "I know," he said, echoing my words. I think some part of me has known for a long time. I just didn't have the language for it yet." He sat up, moving so he was facing me. He took my face in his hands, his touch full of reverence. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "for waiting for me to learn." He kissed me then, a deep, searching kiss that was full of all the words we had finally learned to say. It was a kiss that held the memory of 10 years of friendship, of 2 months of secret comfort, of 1 week of painful silence, and of a lifetime of a future stretching out before us. It was a kiss that said, "We're home." Our life didn't become a grand romance overnight. There were no dramatic declarations to the world. Our coming out was a quiet, gradual process, happening on our own terms. It started with small things. Holding hands while walking down the street late at night. Him introducing me to a work colleague not as his roommate, but with a slight, meaningful pause before saying my name, letting the introduction hang in the air with a new weight. We built our world from the inside out, ensuring its foundation was solid before we invited anyone else in. Our love was not a performance for an audience. It was a quiet, sturdy structure we were building together for us. Sometimes, late at night, I would lie awake next to him, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, and I would think about the sheer improbability of it all. I would think of the decade I spent loving him in silence, convinced that my love was a photograph destined to remain undeveloped. And I would marvel at how life, in its strange and unpredictable way, had given me not just the image, but the living, breathing reality. He was no longer the sun I orbited from a safe distance. We were two stars that had found a new center of gravity, a new system built around a shared light. There are moments in your life that you can point to and say, that is where everything changed for me. It was the weight of a head on my shoulder, a silent surrender on a worn-out couch. It was a moment disguised as something ordinary, a moment of comfort between friends. But it was the hinge on which my entire world swung open. It led us through fear and confusion and pain, but it ultimately led us here, to this quiet room, to this shared bed, to this peaceful, certain love. We didn't find each other in a grand, cinematic moment. We found each other in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together, a silence that was finally filled with love.